Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Cedar Falls Historical Society's lecture on Picturing the Public Arguments Against Suffrage. I am Kate Palczewski, a professor in the Communication and Media Department at the University of Northern Iowa, and affiliate faculty in the Women's and Gender Studies program. I want to thank Diane for organizing this and giving me a chance to chat about my postcard collection. Given that this lecture is focusing on the pictorial or visual elements of the suffrage controversy, a short note of explanation. You won't see me lecturing, but instead you'll get to hear me and look at a number of the postcard images that I'll be talking about. I figured it'd be a lot more interesting to actually look at the postcards than to look at me talking about them. Now, because this is a lecture for the Cedar Falls Historical Society, I figured I should start with just a little bit of history. The turn of the 19th into the 20th century saw the convergence of two strands in social history, the first being the women's suffrage campaign. Suffrage advocacy was both in what the movement members called its doldrums from about 1890 to 1915, but also developing a renaissance during that time. In particular, the years 1896 to 1907 were a time of anti-suffrage ascendancy, where 164 referendum defeats happened at the state, local, community, and even congressional level. If you do the math, this averages out to about one defeat every 27 days. Now, to put this in perspective, the women's suffrage amendment to at the national level was first introduced in Congress in 1878. So you're looking at decades of defeats, and defeats intensifying at about this time. Despite that, though, there was a suffrage renaissance where new blood, new members, new strategies, and new tactics came into the campaign, and you did see a few successes at the state level. Part of this renaissance was the development of a new public image of womanhood, and this needed to be developed as a response to anti-suffrage propaganda that characterized women suffrage advocates as fanatics, as mannish harridans, as unwomanly, or as bad women. So, first strand of social history, the suffrage campaign. The second strand of social history has to do with the golden age of postcards. If you'll notice, during about the same time period, 1893 to 1918, postcards really saw an ascendancy, and it is called the Golden Age. There was a collecting craze that began, so that by the time of the 1908 presidential campaign, the postcard industry was fully geared up to play a role in the election, with postcards reaching their peak during that 1908 campaign. Now, you can see why this was the golden age. The visual imagery and the quality of the production, whether it was relating to a holiday or just beautiful women or a political campaign, was really quite impressive. Now, no one would argue postcards influenced the outcome of the 1908 election, but scholars do think postcards are important to study. When you think about the intersection of women's suffrage during the golden age of postcards, it makes clear the way in which postcards offer a vivid chronicle of American political values and tastes, as George Miller writes about in Political Postcards. Think about how you can come to understand the particular ideologies or thoughts circulating at a time by looking at their postcards. And I want to give an example of that, doing a broad overview of the women's suffrage argument. So Sarah Moore writes this lovely assessment of how women were depicted during the suffrage campaign in the Journal of American Culture. And this is a long quotation from Moore, which I'll be supplementing with images from commercial postcard producers. Moore writes, with social disorder and gender crisis as the principal themes of anti-suffrage rhetoric, the menacing new woman demanding a public voice was widely condemned as socially deviant, sexually and psychologically anomalous, a political pariah, and symptomatic of a diseased society. Note in particular the exposed ankles, because we're going to come back to that as a theme. Moore continues, alternately envisioned as a cigarette-smoking femme fatale with an impertinent sexual appetite, as a homewrecker who has inverted sexual roles and abandoned her natural position as the anchor of bourgeois domesticity, leaving the hapless and utterly unqualified husband to tend to household chores and childcare, or as embittered spinsters or nagging wives, whose unwomanly looks reflect her aberrant political ambitions. Moore notes that the suffragist was depicted as either thin and lacking in the curvaceous form appropriate to femininity and motherhood, unmarriageable, as it were, or as overpowering her henpecked and emasculated husband. The postcards of this time really do show the political and social perceptions of public women. And let's be clear, the power of postcards during their golden age was immense. It rivals the power of the internet, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, all of social media in contemporary times. According to scholars, the pictorial postcard, just like this one, was possibly the great vehicle for messages of the new urban proletariat between 1900 and 1914. Why was that? It was cheap to buy and post, it was simple to use, and quick to arrive in an age of frequent postal deliveries. And think also about social media: cheap, simple, and quick to arrive. During postcards' heyday in the United States, no drawing room table was complete without one of these sort of special albums in which picture postcards could be preserved. And in fact, one's social standing, according to one scholar, could be determined by the style and quality of the picture postcards in the album. Suffrage advocates recognized the utility of postcards as a propaganda device. And so things like the National American Woman Suffrage Association, official organization, used postcards as part of their advocacy. Most of the postcards in the United States were one of three types. They either showed photos of the 1913 parade, or were verbal, or used a little bit of artistry. So a few examples. For example, the 1913 Suffrage Parade, the first time that you had a national sort of focus on a federal suffrage amendment, produced a number of interesting images. So you see photos circulating. While the photos were from commercial photographers, they were taken to the Congressional Union's headquarters after the parade, and the Congressional Union bought and circulated them as a way to add to public attention of this new image of public womanhood. In addition to these photographic type postcards, there also were some official postcards produced by the National American Woman Suffrage Association that contained mottos. And a number of these types of postcards were produced that contained arguments or answered arguments that were made against suffrage. You also can find postcards that celebrate particular states when they enfranchised women. There are a few pro-suffrage postcards that were produced by official organizations that showed pictorial or cartoon images, and these are an example of pretty much most of those. So generally, pro-suffrage postcards were put out by official organizations, tended to be photographic or verbal, with a few that tended to be a little bit more cartoon or illustration specific. In contrast, anti-suffrage postcards were not put out by official organizations. In fact, the vast majority, almost all of the anti-suffrage postcards, were produced by commercial postcard producers. And so their motive was not necessarily to influence public debate as much as it was to sell postcards. So according to a scholar who studied images in Great Britain, commercial postcard publishers had ostensibly no political axe to grind. They were neither employed nor encouraged by the anti-suffrage organizations. But their notion of what was sensational or funny, and hence likely to sell, depended on music hall traditions of humor about women that were deeply misogynist and long rooted in Victorian or Edwardian cultures. Both in the United States and in Great Britain, simply by tapping into prevailing ideology about women, postcard producers assisted anti suffrage forces, almost incidentally, by creating imagery of the female form that used these topical or humorous types. Now, one of the things that you'll notice is most of these postcards focus on the effect of women's suffrage on women, and the verbal arguments focused on those as well. However, there were a few interesting exceptions. While virtually absent in the verbal arguments, there were a number of visual images in postcards that showed the effect of the vote on men. In a way, making the argument that the more women gained political power, the more men became relegated to the home. So, to make things really clear, there were both verbal arguments, arguments that were written in pamphlets, that were delivered in speeches, that were parts of congressional debates on the floor of the Senate or House. There were also visual arguments. So, what I want to do now is sort of summarize what some of the primary verbal arguments were. There were a number of pamphlets produced as states had their own votes about whether or not women's suffrage should be passed. And advocates also collected some of these key arguments into pamphlets that would circulate on their own. An example is Opinions of Eminent Persons Against Women's Suffrage. So let me be clear, this is not me cherry picking what I think are the most outrageous arguments against women's suffrage. This is a pamphlet put together by anti-suffragist groups, and this is their selection of the best arguments against women's suffrage. So I'll go through a few of them. Daniel Webster talked about how the rough contests of the political world are not suited to the dignity and delicacy of your sex. Cardinal Gibbons, who was a Catholic archbishop and the youngest prelate to the First Vatican Council, worried, "If woman enters politics, she will be sure to carry away on her some of the mud and dirt of political contact." LeBaron Briggs says basically that a political competition of both sexes is less likely to elevate men than to degrade women. "I fear the loss of the best that is in woman, and with it the loss of a power that is hers and hers alone." Thomas Bayard, who was Secretary of State, said there was never a falser fact stated that the women of America need any protection further than the love borne to them by their fellow countrymen. Now, one of the things you should see throughout these arguments is the focus is really on the effect of the vote on women, or maybe women's effect of the vote on the state. Pro-suffrage forces did try to answer this argument both verbally and visually. This is a postcard that basically says, if cleaning does not unsex a woman, if working as a nurse or in a factory does not unsex her, then why should the vote unsex her? The visual arguments are really interesting to look at. In many ways, the visual images you see in political cartoons or in postcards reflect many of the verbal arguments. The vote would injure women, only bad women would vote. The interesting thing is that in the verbal arguments, there's an argument present, or in the visual arguments, there's an argument present you don't hear in the verbal arguments, and that is about the effect of the vote on men. And I'll go through a few examples. As women attempted to stretch the meaning of womanhood to incorporate the public act of voting into their role as citizens, opposition attempted to formulate images to depict the effect of women's vote on the home. The image of the male caregiver became prevalent, representing the corollary to their argument that women would be flawed public sphere citizens. Most images depicted men as flawed private sphere fathers. Image after image in the postcard shows this sort of zero-sum trade-off. And like I said, you see all sorts of images of the effect of the vote on men in visual form, But this fear of emasculation is hardly ever articulated in the verbal argument. In fact, I've read the entirety of the congressional record debate on women's suffrage, and in the thousands of pages, in hundreds and hundreds of hours of debate, there's basically two mentions where a little bit of fear at the height of World War I gets articulated about men being emasculated by the vote. This means if you really want to get a sense of some of the political and cultural shifts happening around women's suffrage, you have to look at postcards. You have to look at the visual arguments as well as at the verbal arguments. Now, with that as a broad overview of how images were circulating in postcards at the turn of the last century, I want to dive a little deeper into one particular set. In 1909, the Dunstan-Weiler Company produced a fascinating set of postcards. 12 postcard set in 1909 that is just visually incredibly powerful, stunningly drawn, beautifully illustrated. And what's so fascinating for me about this set is that it both reflected some of the dominant verbal and visual arguments about women, but it also departed from them in some interesting ways. And then it also offers a really interesting look at the effect of the vote on men. So I'll do a really quick overview of all the cards in the set and then spend a little bit of time analyzing a few of the specific ones. Two postcards show fashionably dressed white women, one declaring that her love for the vote was more than her love for her husband, and the other that cigarette-smoking queen of the poll. Two other images depict white women fraudulently electioneering, either by bribing older women with money or men with kisses. Gender-bending images are provided by a white high-heeled suffragette copette in a police uniform. We'll spend more time on that in a bit. A white pantalette suffragette in overalls, and a white beardless Uncle Sam suffragee wearing a skirt. We'll spend more time on Uncle Sam as well. The remaining 5 images show white men at home, in this case successfully caring for infants and toddlers, while women left the home to vote, were away at suffrage rallies, or simply absent. In particular, the suffragette Madonna shows a white man with what is really a charger on a mantelpiece but looks like a halo behind his head, bottle feeding a small child. And let's be clear, while some of these images are very distinct, they are not the only time these images circulate. The suffragette Madonna actually was a recurrent theme in a number of postcards produced by a number of publishers. So these images reflected the verbal arguments that women were incapable of enforcing the result of their vote and that only bad women would vote. Now, the interesting twist is these women were bad not because they were ugly or unfeminine, but because they were so sexualized as public women. So the first thing I'm going to look at is the way this series reflected the verbal arguments. And then I'll look at the way they departed from some of the verbal arguments. Now, these two lines of arguments, why the vote was bad for women or women were bad for the vote, I'll go into a little bit more detail. For argument line 1, this is where the suffragette copette comes into play. This postcard reflected the arguments about women's inability to enforce the effect of their vote. And let's be clear, this was a huge argument at the time. Eileen S. Creditor, in her Germinal History of the Movement, outlines the way this argument was made. If women were to vote, Creditor writes, half the electorate would be incapable of enforcing its mandate, and vicious elements would be encouraged to resort to violence. A vote was not simply the registering of an opinion, it was a demand, and consequently would be meaningless unless exercised only by the muscular portion of the community. This was not a singular argument. It was made over and over again, both by women remonstrants, women opposed to suffrage, but most extensively outlined in Rossiter Johnson's pamphlet, The Blank Cartridge Ballot. The idea was, if you voted, you had to be able to physically enforce the results of your vote, and if you didn't, your vote was just a blank. The New York Association opposed to women's suffrage, and a statement presented to both houses of Congress noted, To extend the suffrage to women would be to introduce into the electorate a vast non-combatant party, incapable of enforcing its own rule. Goldwin Smith argued political power has hitherto been exercised by the male sex, because man alone could uphold government and enforce the law. In other words, the physical power was needed in order to vote for the vote to have any force. And so the idea of a woman being a law enforcement officer was presented as laughable, with her using a rolling pin instead of a truncheon and accompanied by a demure puppy instead of a vicious police dog. Pro-suffragette forces fought against this imagery and tried to make visible, make possible the idea that women could be police officers. However, the postcard imagery of the time really did make this idea of women enforcing the law, enforcing the results of their vote, laughable. So that was argument line 1. Women couldn't enforce the results of their vote. For argument line 2, this is the idea that the vote would coarsen women. The remainder of the postcards depicting women in public reflected the anti-suffragists' verbal arguments concerning how the vote would be bad for women, and their fear that improper women would populate the polls. Historian Jane Jerome Comey analyzes how antis visualized womanhood consisting of set types, consisting of the better class, the indifferent, and the degenerate. Of particular worry to anti-suffragists were prostitutes, whom they feared would overwhelm their more upstanding sisters at the polls, because the best of women would shun political life, and the most unprincipled would then have the field to themselves. Such worries are reflected throughout this imagery. For example, smoking in the Queen of Polls, bribery and electioneering, and the aggressive kissing of suffragette vote-getting. What's interesting about the Dunstan-Weiler set is that in contrast to the oft-seen images of suffragists as masculine, the Dunstan-Weiler postcards depict women acting in public as still feminine, but the type of femininity that women were allowed to maintain was one that was sexualized. And this connection between public woman and sexuality is not accidental. So let me do a little bit of history here. At this time, a prostitute was considered a public woman. So during the Civil War, when sexually transmitted infections were wiping out the Union Army, there was the legalization of prostitution, and the certificate or license that a woman received was to be a public woman. A second example is that in 1898, a young working class woman by the name of Lizzie Shower was walking to visit her uncle and stopped and asked directions from 2 men. She was arrested for being a public woman and was not allowed out of prison until there was a massive public outcry and a physician examined her to confirm that she was still a virgin. Public woman literally meant prostitute. So when you begin looking at these postcards, a little bit more history, the bloomer was proposed initially as a clothing alteration for women because the long skirts were so difficult. It was hard to walk upstairs carrying a candle and a baby. But the bloomer was rejected because it had such an intense erotic quality. If you look at Sears catalogs, sort of the arbiter of fashion at the time, you'll note that up to 1909, skirts go all the way to the floor without even an ankle peeking. But in image after image of the Dunstan-Weiler series, the ankles are exposed. Now, the story of Victorian piano legs prudishly being skirted in order to avoid exciting erotic sentiments might be apocryphal, but it is still the fact that the ankle is coded sexually. And so this use of the bloomer dress reform, the use of the ankle, are all ways to sort of indicate that these are bad women. You also have the coarseness of women with the cigarette smoking Queen of the Polls, as well as the low-cut bodice of Election Day. So half of the postcards in the Dunstan-Weiler series reflected the verbal argument concerning the effect of suffrage on women. Either women were incapable of enforcing their vote, Or should women enter into electoral politics, they would become bad women. They would risk losing their purity and good standing. And conversely, only those who had already lost their good standing would then venture to the polls. Now is where we turn to how there is a departure from the verbal arguments. As I've mentioned, a number of popular culture images showed men being feminized by women's vote. That is my dog in the background who is joining into the lecture, and I hope that you'll forgive. Perhaps he's illustrating the darn this suffragette business anyhow postcard for you all, vocalizing for the puppy in the picture. So you've got a ton of popular culture images of men in the home. And this really does appear to be one of the few traces of this almost inarticulable fear of the emasculated man, who was relegated to homework but was incompetent in the nursery. But what's interesting, in the Dunstan-Weiler series, you have this sort of unique visual argument. While men in the nation would be feminized, they weren't necessarily incompetent at homework. But even as the men were competent, it appealed to anti-suffrage sentiments. For here was the image of the poor, tired husband home from his day's labors, only to find that he must mind the baby or do the dishes so that his wife could prepare a speech or attend a public meeting. Image after image shows men at home. The one thing I hope you may have noticed thus far, though, is virtually all of the men depicted, well, in this image, in this series, all of the men depicted are white. But as critical race scholars note, identity is intersectional. We're never just a sex or just a gender. Race, class, religion, ethnicity, citizenship are always implicated. Of all the postcards, the hundreds that I've seen, virtually none show African Americans, except this one, which echoes some of the domestication of man. And while it does that, it also participates in some of the most venal and vicious racist stereotypes. So I show this postcard to make clear that when we're talking about ideal man and ideal woman, there's an assumption that the ideal man is white and the ideal woman is white, because women of color and poor women were never given access to the ideal of femininity, to the cult of true womanhood. The idea is that true women were pure, pious, domestic, and submissive, and if you had to work for a living, you could not remain domestic. So please make sure you think about and see the way in which bodies are racialized in these images. Now, with that in mind, I want to talk about sort of the trade-off argument that you see in these images. I want to vote, but my wife won't let me. Virginia Woolf, in A Room of One's Own, talks about why often the social standing of women and men is viewed as a zero-sum game. She writes about how women have served all these centuries as looking glasses possessing the magic and delicious power of reflecting the figure of a man at twice its natural size. That is why Napoleon and Mussolini both insist so emphatically upon the inferiority of women. For if women were not inferior, they would cease to enlarge. That serves to explain in part the necessity that women so often are to men. How is he to go on giving judgment, civilizing natives, making laws, writing books, dressing up and speechifying at banquets, unless he can see himself at breakfast and dinner at least twice the size he really is? Reflecting this idea of the zero-sum trade-off is this particular image. Men washing clothes while watching over an infant and a cat. And here, women's exercise of voting rights has stripped man of those rights. To speak to this particular theme in a little bit more detail, the Uncle Sam suffragette postcard comes in really handy as well. The idea that as women gain rights, men will lose them, the effect of women's vote on men. So a little bit of history here. The name Uncle Sam was first used to criticize the United States during the War of 1812, and the first images of Uncle Sam appeared in 1832. Uncle Sam was almost universally depicted with facial hair, or, well, actually he wasn't until about 1856, But then after that, and as a result of some of the influence of Abraham Lincoln, a bewhiskered Uncle Sam became universally recognized likeness. He became in slang Uncle Whiskers or Mr. Whiskers. And in the 1870s, Thomas Nast's cartoons solidified Uncle Sam's characteristics. He was always depicted with a beard, as he is in most widely distributed and recognizable images, like the 1917 James Montgomery flag recruiting poster. Uncle Sam always had a beard, unless he was depicted as a child. In a comprehensive history of Uncle Sam, Alton Ketchum notes that one of the last appearances of a beardless Uncle Sam was in 1865. Even in pro-suffrage literature, he's shown with a beard. But Ketchum is off by 44 years, because in 1909, this beardless image of Uncle Sam circulates. Herbert Knoxon, at the behest of the State Department, had created the official version of Uncle Sam in 1950 and wrote about how he is the United States. He is our composite American personality. He is the symbolic projection of what our country means to us and to other nations. Uncle Sam is the United States. So to feminize Uncle Sam means that you are feminizing the nation. The change in clothes, the shortening of facial hair, the minimization of his height, and making him the object of suffrage, a suffragee, instead of an agent of suffrage as a suffragist. Now, let's be clear about the ways in which Uncle Sam has been stripped of masculinity. One of them I want to talk about, though, relates to comic or cartoon art. So, the average man stands 6.5 heads tall. So if you stacked heads one on top of each other, it would take 6.5 heads to get to the average male height. Comic characters are made to appear heroic by having smaller heads and larger bodies. So they tend to be 8 or more heads tall. When Nash finally stabilized the image of Uncle Sam, he was tall and Lincoln-esque, about 7.5 heads tall. And this image was what was dominant in the 1900s, which is why the Uncle Sam suffragette postcard is so interesting. He stands 6 heads tall, so shorter than an actual human man, and heads shorter than comic depictions of heroism. So you have a nation impacted by suffrage, a nation made feminine when Uncle Sam gets made feminine. The other postcard that depicts the feminization of men is the suffragette Madonna one. And this postcard is really interesting because of the way in which Catholicism and Protestantism were in competition at this particular time period. There was a fear of an influx of Catholic immigrants from Poland, Ireland, and Italy that would overwhelm white Anglo-Saxon Protestants at the polls. And so this postcard could speak to Protestant fears as well as Catholic fears, and then also generally the argument about the feminization of men. In terms of visual piety, most every home might have an image of Murillo's Immaculate Conception, and we're also probably used to the iconic image of Mary and Child, the Madonna images. This postcard participates in those as well. And this is where you have a stoking of anti-suffrage Protestants, because the people who would be voting would be the Catholics. And there were actually some folks who talked about how the great fear was that the Mary Natashas and Bridgets would be overwhelming the polls and also producing a lot more human beings because they were Catholic. This image also spoke to Catholic anti-suffragists because it made palpable the fear that immigrant men, Catholic men, would be forced into the home. And for immigrant communities, the home was one of the safe places where the men were actually in control. So this postcard speaks to this idea that there would be a trade-off between women and men. Now, we've been spending a lot of time about 110 years ago, but I want to make clear that some of these same images and critiques of public women persist into contemporary times. And so thinking about how these images got created over 100 years ago might make us more attuned to seeing their deployment in contemporary politics. So if you go back to the last presidential election, you will see numerous times in which Donald Trump talked about Hillary Clinton not having a presidential look, or referring to Clinton as weak and ineffective with no strength or stamina. And here you hear those echoes about political life being too wearing to women, or that women lacked the political power to enforce their vote. Mike Pence, in campaigning for their ticket, mentioned over and over and over and over again that Trump was broad shouldered. Again, hearkening to a masculine sort of depiction of men as broad shouldered and women as weak. For the sexualization of women, you can go back to 2007, where during her initial run for the Democratic nomination, Hillary Clinton sparked cleavage gate because while on the campaign trail, while arguing on the floor of the Senate, she wore a shirt that actually exposed cleavage. Again, this fear of the sexualized woman in public. And in 2019, Kristen Sinema, a senator, caused outcry because she happened to wear tall boots while on the floor of the Senate. And the criticisms of Sinema again harken back to this notion of the public woman as the sexualized woman, as the prostitute, as overly sexualized. In addition to those criticisms of public women, you also have critiques of women for not being likable. So again, think back to the images of suffragists as mannish harridans, as vicious, as unnatural. And so in this most recent presidential nomination campaign, you have this recurring question about whether or not a female candidate is likable if she argues, if she is a strong public advocate. So learning about the historical images helps us figure things out in the contemporary moment. I end this lecture with an illustration from a suffragist coloring book in case you've got small people in your life and think it might be fun for them to do some images. And I also wanted to provide a couple other additional resources. If you're interested in looking at some of these postcards in real life, the Grout Museum has a display up, Remember the Ladies, in which a number of the postcards that are in my collection are on display, as well as a number of other things from state and local historical societies. And I strongly recommend that you take a little bit of time to visit them while masked and socially distant. Also, if you want to look at more of the postcards, the entirety of my collection has been scanned by the University of Northern Iowa Library and is available online. And so you can look at both the front and the back side of every single postcard in my collection if you want to spend more time with them or look at some of the other images. I really appreciate you spending your time with me today, and I hope you found this virtual lecture both entertaining and educational. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me at UNI. You can find my email address there pretty easily, and I'd be glad to provide resources if you're teaching or working on projects about suffrage. Thank you.